Reverie and Interpretation, Thomas H. Ogden, Ch2. Analyzing Forms of Aliveness and Deadness. Part 2. Case 3. In ongoing consultation with clinicians who come to me to discuss analyses that they are conducting, I ask that the analyst attempt to talk with me not only about what the analysis and analysand say to one another, but also about the analyst's moment-to-moment thoughts, feelings, and sensations. The analyst is asked to include this aspect of his work in his process notes that he records during the analytic hours and discusses with me in our consultation meetings. In addition, I suggest that the analyst write process notes for all meetings, including those that the patient fails to attend. I operate under the assumption that the patient's physical absence creates a specific form of psychological effect in the analyst and in the analysis, and that the analytic process continues despite the analysand's physical absence. In this way, the specific meanings of the patient's presence in his absence are transformed into analytic objects to be fully experienced, lived with, symbolized, understood, and made part of the analytic discourse. In using process notes in this way, the analyst attempts to symbolize and speak to himself about his experience with the patient, no matter how seemingly unrelated to the analysand. The analyst's fantasies, physical sensations, ruminations, daydreams, and so on might appear to be Ogden 1992 A.B., 1994 A.B.C.D. I do not insist that a supervisee discuss with me this aspect of the analytic experience, since some analysts are initially temperamentally incapable of attending to this level of their experience. Moreover, the analysts consulting with me are not always sufficiently at ease with themselves or with me to entrust this aspect of their work to me. However, I have found that as the supervisory relationship unfolds, supervisors are usually able to develop these capabilities and make use of this aspect of the analytic experience in their therapeutic work and in consultation. I have also found that it is rare for a therapist to be able to engage in this form of supervisory experience without having previously taken part in a successful personal analysis. In the absence of such an experience in analysis, which is not to invoke the illusion of the completed analysis, it is unusual for a therapist to have developed the capacity to make analytic use of his mundane, quotidian, unobtrusive thoughts, feelings, and sensations that occupy him during the analytic hours. As with most aspects of analytic technique, attention to and use of the analyst's private discourse that is seemingly unrelated to the patient runs counter to the character defenses that we have developed in the course of our lives. To attempt to loosen our dependence on these character defenses often feels like tearing off a layer of skin, leaving us with a diminished stimulus barrier with which to protect the boundary between inner and outer, between receptivity and overstimulation, between sanity and insanity. The analytic work that I shall now describe occurred in the context of the supervision of an analyst who had been consulting with me on a weekly basis for about a year. The analysis had begun in a way that was quite disappointing to the analyst. The analysand, Dr. C, was a resident in family practice medicine who had read about psychoanalysis in college, medical school, and residency. He had a strong sense of the rules of analysis and complied with them, although from the beginning he complained about the rigidity of the game. For example, the analysand's having to pay for missed meetings, the requirement that the analysand take his vacations when the analyst does, the demand for compliance with the fundamental rule, and so on. With the exception of the fee arrangement, the analyst had said nothing about these rules. Dr. C's reasons for being in analysis were vague. He felt he should learn about himself as part of his training as a family practice physician. The idea that he was asking for help with the psychological pain that he was experiencing would have represented an imagined act of submission that the patient could not have tolerated at the beginning of the analysis. The analysand was on time for each session and compliantly free associated, presenting a blend of dreams, childhood memories, sexual fantasies, and current work-related, marital and child-rearing difficulties and stresses. There were confessions of secret acts about which the patient felt shame, for example, the use of pornographic magazines during masturbation and 2 incidents of cheating on medical school laboratory reports. However, from the earliest days and weeks of analysis, the analyst, Dr. F, experienced the patient as boring to a degree to which he was unaccustomed. It felt as if the patient were attempting to imitate what he had imagined went on in a good analysis. It required considerable forbearance for Dr. F to refrain from entering into the analysis with interpretations of the content that was being presented, for example, interpretation of dream material that seemed to beg for transference interpretations. In consultation, Dr. F discussed the possible interpretations that he might have made, but had chosen to defer. It seemed to me that these interpretations would have been imitations of deep transference interpretations and would have been offered in an effort on the part of Dr. F to create his own fantasy of a good analysis. As time went on, the analyst felt greatly tempted to chastise the analysand or even comment contemptuously on the emptiness of the patient's verbiage. At each stage, an important perspective that was elaborated in the consultation included the idea that it was of critical importance for Dr. F not to enter into an empty, inert discourse with the patient, and at the same time it was crucial that the analyst maintain his capacity to entertain any thought, feeling, or sensation that arose within him. See Byon 1978, Symington 1983. No possible interpretation or response to the patient was to be reflectively dismissed or stifled. It required enormous psychological effort on the part of Dr. F to resist becoming mechanical, detached, or imitative of an idealized version of his own analyst or of me. Dr. F developed his own style of taking process notes in which he was able to capture something of the totality of the experience of the hour, including the details of his own experience. I think of this as the effort of the analyst to focus upon the countertransference aspects of the transference. Countertransference as total situation, Joseph 1985, Klein 1952, Ogden 1991a. In other words, it is the transference countertransference, not simply the transference, that constitutes the matrix in which psychological meanings are generated in the analytic situation. As Dr. F would present the hours to me in our weekly consultation sessions, neither of us felt pressured to draw one-to-one correspondences between Dr. F's thoughts and feelings and those of the patient. At times, we each offered tentative understa 11 dings of the relationship between Dr. F's experience and what was happening in the analytic hour. Usually, Dr. F's reveries were simply noted and were allowed to reverberate within him and within me as we listened to the subsequent material. We sometimes referred back in our discussions to reveries that Dr. F had presented in consultation meetings weeks or months earlier. Dr. F's thoughts in the initial months of analysis often included wishful images of his upcoming vacations or of memories of recent browsing in interesting shops and bookstores during his afternoon breaks. These were understood not simply as generic escapist fantasies, but in each instance were felt to reflect a specific response to what was occurring in the analysis at that particular moment. At one point, several of Dr. F's vacation daydreams were of an unrealistically idealized sort and seemed to reflect the make-believe nature of the analysis. The patient did not want an actual analysis, he defensively desired a perfect one. In other words, the analysand unconsciously wished for an omnipotently created analysis that did not involve actual encounters between himself and another person with all the anxieties associated with the human lapses, misunderstandings, and so on that would have entailed. Dr. F attempted to keep alive in himself his capacity to be curious, to question, to comment spontaneously on what was occurring in the analytic interaction despite the canned responses that he would often receive from the patient. Analytic etiquette was not treated as sacred by Dr. F, much to the surprise and disapproval of the patient. For instance, the patient at one point indicated that he wanted advice from Dr. F, but immediately added that he knew that Dr. F could not give him advice. Dr. F responded by asking the patient why he could not give the patient advice. In the end, no advice was given, and instead there was a discussion of the patient's use of fantasied rules, his own omnipotent creations and projections, for the purpose of preventing himself from experiencing and thinking about the personal, idiosyncratic, unpredictable nature of the experience that was occurring between Dr. F and himself. When Dr. F found himself feeling curious about an aspect of the material that the patient was discussing, he asked the patient for further details even when the question seemed tangential. For example, at one point, Dr. F asked the patient for the name of a restaurant that the patient had parenthetically mentioned having enjoyed the previous evening. The analyst was well aware that the omission of the detail, the name of the restaurant, very likely represented a way of tantalizing and excluding the analyst, a projection of the patient's curiosity and feeling of exclusion from the life of the analyst. However, at the time, Dr. F decided to ask, perhaps more accurately, found himself asking, for the detail, about which he felt curious while deferring exploration of the tantalizing effect of the omission of this particular detail. Coltett, 1986, has made a similar recommendation with regard to allowing oneself to laugh at a patient's jokes before analyzing the conscious and unconscious motivations of the patient's wish to get the analyst to laugh. It should be emphasized that while Dr. F attempted to ensure space in the analysis for spontaneity and freedom of thought, he by no means treated the analytic frame in a cavalier manner. Hours were begun and ended in a timely way. Casual conversation did not occur between the waiting room and the consulting room. Suggestion, reassurance, exhortation, and the like played no larger a part in this analysis than in others conducted by this careful and thoughtful analyst. For most of the first year of analysis, Dr. F felt that the life of the analysis resided almost entirely in his own capacity to maintain his freedom for reverie during the analytic hours and in his discussions with me of these reveries. By the beginning of the first half of the second year of analysis, the patient began to evidence changes in his ability to speak with a voice of his own that no longer seemed quite as cliched, stereotypic, and imitative as before. However, the changes seemed fragile and short-lived to Dr. F. In this period of analysis, Dr. F presented a session in consultation in which the patient was silent for the first few minutes of the meeting. Dr. F told me that during this period of silence he had been thinking about the fact that I would be spending my Christmas break in Hawaii. He wondered if I would bring Christmas presents along with me on the trip, all wrapped in shiny red and green paper. He imagined how odd it would be to exchange Christmas gifts in Hawaii and pictured my wife giving me a woolen sweater as a Christmas gift. I commented that I thought Dr. F was expressing skepticism about some of the ideas that we had been discussing in the course of the supervision, particularly the emphasis I had been placing on the importance of Dr. F's capacity for creativity and spontaneity in his work, as opposed to adopting reflexive, imitative, prefabricated approaches. In the course of discussing Dr. F's reverie concerning my vacation, I said to Dr. F that I thought that he was depicting me as participating in a self-deceptive charade in which I was treating Christmas as something that could be dug up and moved from one place to another without any change in the experience, as one might move a plant from one side of a garden to another. The feeling in the daydream was that Christmas had become entirely a form for me and that I had lost touch with any meaning or feeling beyond the conventional activities associated with it. This reverie depicted Dr. F's disappointment, as well as some degree of competitive pleasure, in viewing me as lacking self-understanding with regard to my own mechanicalness. It seemed to both Dr. F, and to me that Dr. F, was saying to both of us, Ogden talks a good game about realness, authenticity, genuineness, spontaneity, and so on, but when it comes down to it, maybe he doesn't know what's real and what isn't. Dr. F and I discussed the way in which my placing a premium on spontaneity may have created a dilemma of sorts for Dr. F. He may have begun to find himself attempting to train himself to be spontaneous. To make matters worse, he may have unconsciously felt that achieving spontaneity would involve imitating me. Dr. F came to see more clearly as a result of the discussion of this Christmas reverie that his patient had been laboring under a similar burden in the analysis for some time. For months, Dr. C had said that he felt an internal pressure to be on in analysis, that is, to be interesting to Dr. F. Only at this point did Dr. C's comment take on an analytic meaning, become an analytic object that could be symbolized, reflected upon, and interpreted. Dr. F felt that he now better understood that the patient's internal pressure to be on reflected the patient's unconscious fantasy that he could only be alive for Dr. F, to the degree that he could learn to think, feel, speak, and behave in a manner like or the same as Dr. F. This placed the patient in an impossible position in which feeling alive and being interesting to Dr. F had become synonymous. Paradoxically, the idea of feeling alive had for Dr. C become unconsciously equivalent to becoming an idealized version of Dr. F. In the course of the succeeding weeks of analysis, Dr. F offered to the analysand his understanding of this dilemma that he believed to underlie Dr. C's feeling of pressure to be on in analysis. Both this interpretation and Dr. F's self-understanding I11G upon which it rested facilitated the creation of psychological space in the analysis in which both the patient and the analyst were able to continue to develop their capacity to generate thoughts, feelings and sensations without feeling that there was an unstated script or paradigm that either of them was being asked to mouth or imitate. In the clinical sequence just described, it was essential for the analyst to be able to have his own thoughts independent of mine, which need was symbolized by Dr. F's unconscious criticism of me in the Christmas reverie. Only when Dr. F became aware of the way in which his own capacity for original thought had been paralyzed by his fear of confronting his defensive idealization of me, could he regain his full capacity for reverie. Dr. F's symbolization of and understanding of this defensive process as it was portrayed in the Christmas reverie formed the basis for his interpretation of his patient's futile attempts to overcome his own experience of deadness by, in fantasy, attempting to become a perfect patient, that is, to become a defensively idealized version of his conception of an analytic patient. Case 4. The final clinical vignette that I shall present will focus on the problem of competing, Tustin 1980, see also Ogden 1989 AB, with a form of deadness that involves a pathologically autistic aspect of personality. In the analysis of adult patients, the autistic component of the personality is often not at all evident in the beginning of analysis, S. Klein 1980. This was the case in the analysis of Mrs. S. In the initial analytic meeting, Mrs. S. talked about her difficulties in getting her life together. She had not been able to graduate from college as a result of her inability to concentrate. Her marriage was in disarray and she felt on the edge of panic. It is not possible in the space of the present paper to offer an account of the stages of the evolution of the analytic process over the first 8 years of this 5-session per week analysis. The outcome of these years of work might very broadly be summarized by saying that despite the fact that there had been important changes in the patient's ability to function in the world, for example, she was able to graduate from college and hold a responsible job, the patient's capacity to enter into relationships with other people remained very limited. Mrs. S. and her husband slept in separate bedrooms and on occasion engaged in what the patient described as mechanical sex. It had required more than 5 years of analysis for the patient to even recognize that she managed her 3 children as if she were an employee of a daycare center, and that she had very little sense of each of them as individuals. Her friendships were shallow and only toward the end of the 7th year of analysis did she begin to feel the absence of loving relationships in her life. In the analytic relationship, I was again and again stunned, in a way that I have rarely experienced with other patients, by the depth of the patient's inability to evidence or experience any warmth toward me. It was not that Mrs. S. did not feel dependent on me. She was greatly distressed by weekend breaks, vacations, her own as well as mine, the end of each session, and would frequently telephone my answering machine in order to hear my voice, without leaving a message of her own. However, Mrs. S. experienced her dependence not as a personal attachment, but as an addiction that she deeply resented. She once instructed me, a heroin addict does not love heroin. The fact that she'll kill to get it doesn't mean she loves it or feels any kind of affection for it. The patient felt powerfully untouchable in her isolation and seemed to value this feeling of being immune to human vulnerabilities more than anything else in life. This untouchable quality was reflected in her anorectic symptomatology. The patient subsisted on a diet of fruit, grains and vegetables and organized her life around a rigorous exercise regime that included marathon jogging and the extensive use of a stationary bicycle. The patient exercised vigorously for at least 3 hours every day. If the EXE one-size routine were in any way disrupted, for example, by illness or by travel, the patient would experience a state of intense anxiety that on 2 occasions developed into a full-blown panic attack. Mrs. S. at the beginning of the analysis, experienced no appetite for food, sex, ideas, art, or anything else. The patient's weight held the greatest importance for her. By maintaining a particular weight, at the very low end of what she could tolerate physiologically without falling physically ill, she experienced a form of power that allowed her in fantasy to control everything that might occur both within her and outside of her. It would be inaccurate to say that the patient always felt numb or without feelings in the analytic hours. Mrs. S frequently experienced intense anger, which she called hatred, toward me. However, her anger never seemed personal. By this I mean that it never felt as if her anger had anything to do with me. The hatred did not even seem to be the patient's personal creation. Rather, it seemed like a blind, reflexive, almost convulsive thrashing about that occurred when her sense of absolute control and ownership of me was compromised. Since I was the person/object who happened to be there, it was I who happened to be the object of her rage. Mrs. S.'s criticism of me always involved her projective fantasy of my omnipotence. She felt that I could easily give her what she needed if I chose to, but I stubbornly refused to do so. Other than her single-minded crusade to gain access to my fantasied omnipotent power, there seemed to be very little about me that was of interest to the patient. It was difficult for me to accept how little I seemed to mean to this patient outside of the terms of the fantasy I am discussing. For years, I held to the belief that Mrs. S secretly loved me, albeit in a primitive way, felt a form of concern for me, knew something about who I am as a person, but stubbornly refused to admit it. This belief was based on the intensity of the patient's feeling of dependence on me in conjunction with the fact that I felt concern for and interest in her. At times, I interpreted what I felt to be the patient's anxiety about acknowledging any feeling of human connection with me for fear of the loss of control over her external and internal world that would entail. She would respond by saying that what I said might be true, but she was not aware of feeling affection, love, warmth, or even concern for me or for anyone else for that matter. The defensive function of such a stance on the patient's part was discussed on many occasions, but did not lead to any discernible effective change. These interpretations felt increasingly stale to both the patient and to me. Perhaps it was the patient's response to the death of my father that was the beginning of my loosening of my hold on the belief that the patient secretly felt some form of love or concern for me. The events transpiring between Mrs. S and myself around this event, in the 8th year of analysis, led me to feel that there was a qualitative difference between the human disconnectedness achieved by Mrs. S and forms of defense against the dangers of love and hate that I had encountered with other patients. After receiving the unexpected news of my father's death, I telephoned my patients and supervisors to tell them that there had been a death in my family and that I would be canceling several days' meetings. I told each of them that I would phone them to tell them when I would be resuming work. When I spoke with Mrs. S, she received the news quietly, but immediately asked me if I knew approximately when I would be returning to work. I said that I did not know, but would let her know when I did. In our first meeting after my return, Mrs. S said that she was sorry that someone in my family had died. There was unmistakable anger in her voice as she underscored the vagueness of the word, someone. She fell silent for a few minutes and then said that it made her feel furious not to know who it was who had died, and said that she felt that I had been sadistic in not giving her that information when I phoned her. She added that she was certain that I had told all my other patients who it was in my family that had died. During this interchange, I felt deeply disturbed by a recognition against which I had struggled for most of a decade. It seemed to me that Mrs. S was unable to feel anything for me as a human being beyond her need to protect herself by means of her efforts to magically enter me and control me from within. At this point in the meeting, I began to recall the details of the feelings that I had felt during the telephone call that I had made to Mrs. S soon after I learned of my father's death. I remembered with great vividness the feeling of attempting to control my voice as I spoke to her in an effort to hold back tears. I wondered whether it was possible that she had heard nothing of that. How could she have not experienced that moment, as I had, as one in which there had been a close connection between the two of us? Instead, she apparently experienced it as still another occasion in which her omnipotent wishes had healed. Frustrated. I could hear the voice with which I was speaking to myself at that moment in the meeting as the voice of a person experiencing a sense of impenetrable alienation from Mrs. S. At the same time, I also recognized something else in that voice for the first time. LT was the voice of a spurned lover. It occurred to me that Mrs. S lived in a world in which two different forms of human experience each disguised the other. At that juncture, I felt that I had arrived at the beginnings of an understanding of something about the relationship between Mrs. S and myself that I had not previously grasped. This new understanding did not serve to protect me from the chilling inhumanness that I had sensed in Mrs. S, and which I knew reflected important autistic and paranoid schizoid elements in her personality. Neither did it serve to dim the recognition that alongside these powerful autistic and paranoid schizoid defenses was a capacity for human love. I could at this point see in retrospect that it was in part my own lack of compassion for Mrs. S and her wishes to comfort me as my wife that had led me to blind myself to the fact that her seeming absence of compassion represented a complex interplay of two powerful coexisting aspects of her personality. She had been concerned about me and felt despondent that her love was unrecognizable to me, for example, as reflected in my not allowing her to comfort me. At the same time, there was an important way in which Mrs. S was unable to come to life as a human being and instead occupied a mechanical, omnipotent world of 1. Relatedness to autistic shapes and autistic objects, Tustin 1980-1984. For example, the mechanical self-sufficiency involved in the sensation world of exercise and diet, and 2. Paranoid schizoid fantasies of entering me and parasitically living in me and through me. I had been unable to live with, formulate, and interpret for myself and for the patient the mutually obscuring interrelationship between being alive and being dead, i.e., the coexistence of depressive, paranoid schizoid and autistic contiguous, Ogden 1989 A-B dimensions of the patient's personality. Mrs. S. had loved me and had felt nothing whatsoever for me at the same time. I had experienced affection for her, which I came to recognize more fully in my experience of feeling like a spurned lover, but could not allow myself to feel warmth or at times even feel compassion for someone who was so clearly inhuman and inhumane, for example, in her treatment of her husband, her children, and in her response to me, particularly after my father's death. Later in the session that I am describing, I said to Mrs. S. that I thought I had underestimated two things in our relationship: the amount of affection that there was and the degree to which no relationship at all existed between us. When I lost sight of one or the other facet of the situation, I failed to understand the totality of who she is and who we are together. I added that I thought that the degree to which it was possible for there to be no human tie between us had diminished in the time that we had known one another, but that it remained a considerable force to be reckoned with. Mrs. S. responded by saying that I had never spoken to her in that way before. Previously, she had always felt that there was a way in which I was as cold as she was and that she could hear the iciness in my voice. She could not detect that coldness in me just now. Mrs. S. went on to say that she did not believe that iciness was gone, but at least it did not dominate everything that occurred between us for the moment. I understood this to be a statement of the patient's feeling of relief in her sense that she could accept understanding from me, which was something she never before had been able to do without immediately attacking it, or more often, withdrawing into a state of autistic self-sufficiency or omnipotent paranoid schizoid defensive fantasy. My interpretation had denied neither her emotional deadness, her paranoid schizoid and autistic contiguous modes of protecting herself, nor her increased capacity to experience a human connection to me, albeit very sparingly acknowledged by her. Concluding comments. I have presented 4 clinical discussions in an effort to illustrate ways in which the sense of aliveness and deadness are generated and experienced in and through the intersubjective analytic third. In each of the clinical situations described, the analyst attempted to create analytic meaning, analytic objects, from that which had been unconsciously present in and powerfully shaping of the analytic encounter, but had been foreclosed from the analytic discourse. It was through the analyst's use of his reveries, his unobtrusive, quotidian thoughts, feelings, and sensations, often seemingly unrelated to the patient, that specific, verbally symbolized meanings were generated and eventually utilized in the interpretive process. In the 4 analyses described, the particular quality of the experience of aliveness and deadness generated in the transference-countertransference constituted an important intersubjective construction that reflected a central aspect of the analysand's pathologically structured internal object world.